There was a door you pushed open, and the world changed on the other side of it. Not dramatically, not the way a theater curtain rises on something designed to astonish. More quietly than that, more warmly. The smell reached you first, a particular combination of warm hair and setting lotion, and the faint sweetness of talcum powder, and the deeper chemical note of permanent wave solution that should not have been pleasant, and somehow was, because it was the smell of a place that had its own complete atmosphere, its own rules, its own rhythm that had nothing to do with the world you had just left on the sidewalk outside. Then the sound, the low, continuous hum of hood dryers running, the particular click of scissors moving through damp hair, the murmur of conversation that was not quite the conversation of any other place, lower than a party, more continuous than a waiting room, carrying the specific quality of talk between women who had temporarily set down the roles they carried everywhere else, and were simply themselves for an hour or two. Then the warmth. A beauty salon in the 1950s was always warm. The dryers produced it. The steam from the shampoo bowls contributed to it. The simple fact of a room full of women who had come in from the cold and were being attended to added to it. It was the warmth of a place designed for comfort in an era when comfort was not something most women's daily lives offered in abundance. This was the American beauty salon of the 1950s. Not a spa, not a luxury experience in the modern sense of the word, not something reserved for special occasions or income brackets that could afford the high end of anything. It was for millions of ordinary American women, simply the place they went. Once a week, or every 2 weeks, or monthly for the permanents and touch-ups that required a professional hand. It was a fixture of daily life in a way that the modern salon is not, and it served purposes that went considerably beyond the hair that walked out the door looking better than the hair that walked in. If you have ever wondered what those salons were actually like inside, not the glamorized version and not the simplified nostalgia, but the actual experience of being a woman in a 1950s beauty salon on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, stay with us. We are going inside, from the moment you pushed that door open to the moment you stepped back out onto the sidewalk with your hair freshly set and 2 hours of conversation still warm in your memory. Consider subscribing before we begin. We find these forgotten corners of American daily life one at a time, and there are many more still worth visiting. One honest word before we start. The 1950s beauty salon existed within the specific social and economic context of its era, which meant it was often segregated, that the beauty standards it served were narrow, and that the industry itself reflected the inequalities of the society around it. We are not going to look away from any of that, but we are also going to look at what those salons contained that was genuinely worth preserving in memory, because they contained quite a lot. Let us begin at the beginning, at the door, at the moment you walked in. The appointment and what it meant. Making a salon appointment in the 1950s was a different kind of transaction than scheduling a haircut today, and understanding that difference helps explain why the salon meant what it did to the women who went there. You called on the telephone. This was not a text, not an app, not an online booking system that showed you available slots in a grid. You called the salon, and the woman who answered, often the owner herself in a smaller shop, knew your name. She knew that you had been coming every Friday at 2 o'clock for 3 years. She knew that you preferred the second chair from the window, and that you took your coffee with 2 sugars, and that last time, you had mentioned your daughter's recital, and she would ask how it went. The appointment was not just a time slot. It was a kept relationship. The salon remembered you between visits, in the way that a small business in a community remembered its regulars, not from a computer system, but from genuine familiarity built across dozens of visits and thousands of exchanged words. For many women, the regularity of the salon appointment was one of the few fixed personal appointments in a weekly schedule that otherwise belonged entirely to the household and the family. A doctor's appointment was medically necessary. A dentist appointment was not looked forward to. The salon appointment was something a woman looked forward to, something that was entirely for her. And the scheduling of it, the confirmation of it, the small, reliable fact of its existence on Thursday at 2 o'clock, carried weight beyond its practical function. It was proof, weekly or bi-weekly, that she existed as a person with her own appointments, not only as the manager of everyone else's. The exterior and what you saw walking up. A 1950s beauty salon announced itself from the street with a particular visual vocabulary that was consistent enough across the country to be almost universal, and recognizable enough that a woman arriving in an unfamiliar town could identify the salon from half a block away. The window was the first announcement. Many salons painted their windows partially, leaving the lower portion opaque or frosted for the privacy of the women inside, while leaving the upper portion clear. Some decorated the visible portion with hand-lettered gold script announcing the proprietor's name, often a woman's first name or a combination like Helen's Beauty Shop or Marie's Salon of Beauty. The word beauty appeared constantly and without irony. It was a direct statement of purpose that the era had no embarrassment about making. The sign above the door was often lighted, frequently in pink or white neon, because a beauty salon was open in the late afternoon when it was already getting dark in winter. And the lighted sign was practical as much as decorative. The pink neon through a frosted window in the early evening, casting its particular warm color onto the wet sidewalk outside, is one of the specific visual signatures of the era that appears in photographs and films of the period, with a reliability that suggests how genuinely common it was. The door itself was often glass, allowing a woman approaching to see inside without committing to entering. Though once you had been going to the same salon for any length of time, the door opened before you could pull it, because someone inside had seen you coming and was already greeting you by name. The interior, what you saw, smelled, heard. The interior of a 1950s beauty salon was a specific environment with a specific atmosphere that bore little resemblance to the minimalist, Instagram-curated aesthetics of modern salons, and everything resemblance to a particular kind of American commercial interior that was warm, slightly cluttered, deliberately comfortable, and deeply human. The walls were often painted in the soft colors of the era, pink, peach, pale aqua, the colors of femininity as the 1950s understood it, which were also simply comfortable colors that made a room feel welcoming rather than clinical. The lighting was warm rather than bright, because a beauty salon understood that a woman sitting under a hood dryer for 45 minutes did not want to feel like she was in an operating theater, and that warm light was more flattering at every stage of the process, from the slightly alarming stage when the rollers were in and nothing looked quite right, to the finished stage when everything looked very right indeed. The chairs were arranged along the walls, and in a central row if the salon was large enough, Each chair was the kind of substantial, upholstered rotating chair that the era produced in abundance, comfortable enough to sit in for the duration of a full appointment, which could run 2 hours or more without anyone finding this remarkable. They swiveled. They often had a small footrest. The mirror in front of each chair was framed rather than simply mounted flush to the wall, often with small vanity lights around the frame that were slightly theatrical and entirely appropriate. Between the chairs, on every available surface, were the tools and products of the trade, and they were not hidden. Rollers in their various sizes sat in wire baskets or plastic trays, organized by the operator who used them with the particular efficiency of someone who used the same tools dozens of times every day. Setting lotion in its plastic bottles, end papers, the small squares of tissue that protected the hair ends when rollers went in their flat stacks. Bobby pins in their paper-covered packages or their small magnetic dishes. Hairnets, fine as spider silk, in their tissue paper. Rat-tail combs and styling combs and teasing combs, each designed for a specific purpose within the process. The shampoo bowls, which were typically at the back of the salon, were porcelain or molded plastic, designed to support the neck of a woman leaning back with her hair in the bowl while warm water ran through it and someone's hands worked shampoo through to the ends. They were not the elegant backward tilt sink setups that modern salons often feature. They were workmanlike and functional, and the experience of having someone else wash your hair above them was one of the specific sensory pleasures of the salon visit that women from that era describe with a consistency that says something about how rarely most of them were simply physically attended to. The dryers were arranged along one wall or the back of the salon, large hood dryers on swiveling arms that came down over a woman's head and enclosed her in a warm, humming cocoon of hot air for the duration of the set drying time, which was typically 30 to 45 minutes. Under the dryer was where the reading happened, where the conversation between adjacent dryer sitters happened, where the magazines were flipped through and the coffee was drunk, and the particular suspension of normal time that characterized the salon experience was most completely felt. The magazines under the dryer deserve their own mention. Life, Look, Good Housekeeping, Ladies' Home Journal, Vogue for the salons whose clientele wanted it, movie magazines for the salons whose clientele preferred those, women's service magazines with their recipes and household tips and fashion pages. These were not the celebrity gossip publications of later decades, though they contained celebrity content. They were general interest publications aimed at women, and they were read with an attention that the dryer's enforced stillness made possible. Under the dryer was one of the few places in a 1950s woman's week where she sat still with a magazine for long enough to actually finish an article. The operators, who they were and what they knew. The women who ran and staffed 1950s beauty salons were professionals in a specific and important sense of the word, one that the era's cultural dismissal of women's work obscured but did not diminish. A licensed cosmetologist in the 1950s had completed a training program that was typically a year to a year and a half in length, studying not only the technical skills of cutting, setting, perming, and coloring hair, but also scalp and skin conditions, the chemistry of the products she would use, the anatomy of hair growth and damage, and, in many states, basic sanitation and hygiene requirements that were legally enforced by the cosmetology board that issued and renewed her license. The skills she arrived at the salon chair with were not small. The permanent wave process alone required precise timing, careful sectioning, correct rod selection for the desired curl size, exact application of waving solution, careful neutralization, and the ability to assess the hair's condition throughout the process and adjust if something was not proceeding correctly. A permanent wave done incorrectly could result in hair so damaged it broke off. A permanent wave done by a skilled operator produced results that held their shape for months. The roller set, which was the primary service for most women's weekly appointments, required an understanding of how curl direction affected the finished style, how roller size related to wave size, how the placement of rollers, from the crown through the sides and nape, needed to work together to produce a coherent, finished shape, rather than a collection of individual curls that did not flow into one another. A skilled operator could look at a woman's face shape, the natural growth patterns of her hair, the texture and thickness she was working with, and produce a set that would, when combed out, do exactly what it was supposed to do. These were real skills. They were acquired through training and refined through years of daily practice. The woman who had been doing sets every day for 10 years knew things about hair that no training program had explicitly taught her. Things learned from the specific feedback of working with thousands of different heads across thousands of appointments. And then there was the other knowledge, the knowledge that was not in any curriculum, but was perhaps the most important skill a salon operator possessed: the knowledge of her clients. She knew which women came in carrying attention that was visible from across the room and needed to be given time and quiet before conversation was attempted. She knew which women came in desperate for someone to talk to and needed the 45 minutes under the dryer to say the things they could not say at home. She knew which women were dealing with things that they would mention only obliquely: a husband's temper mentioned in passing, a financial worry framed as a joke, a health concern expressed as an observation about someone else's health concern. And she knew how to receive all of it without judgment and without the kind of advice-giving that was not wanted. She was, in the language that a later era would develop for such roles, a trusted confidant, not a therapist, not a counselor, simply a person who knew you, saw you consistently, remembered what you had said last time, and was reliably, professionally, privately in your corner, in the specific way of a woman whose livelihood depended on her clients trusting her enough to keep coming back. The services. What happened in that chair? A complete picture of the 1950s salon experience requires understanding what was actually done there, because the services were more varied and more technically demanding than the simplified shampoo and set summary that they are sometimes reduced to. The shampoo and set was the most common weekly service. A woman's hair was shampooed at the shampoo bowl, conditioned if her hair was dry or damaged, towel-dried to the point of damp rather than wet, and then returned to the styling chair, where the operator sectioned, rolled, applied setting lotion, and put in the rollers in the pattern that would produce the finished style. The entire head, rolled and pinned and netted, was then moved under the dryer for the drying time, after which the rollers were removed and the hair was combed out, teased at the crown if the style called for it, smoothed at the sides, shaped, and sprayed to hold. This process took approximately an hour and a half, from shampoo to finished comb-out, and it was expected to hold for a week, which it generally did when done correctly, which is why women came once a week rather than more often. The set was maintained between appointments by sleeping on a satin pillowcase, wearing a hairnet at night to protect the style, and touching up with a few pin curls or a small roller at home if anything had lost its shape by midweek. The permanent wave was a different order of service entirely. It was typically done every 3 to 4 months, sometimes less often for women who wanted a loose wave rather than tight curl. The process involved sectioning the hair into small, uniform sections, winding each section onto a permanent wave rod of the appropriate size, applying the waving solution, timing the processing, rinsing, applying the neutralizer, timing the neutralization, removing the rods, rinsing again, and finally setting the newly waved hair in the desired style. The entire service could take 3 hours or more, and during that time, the operator's attention was on the processing in a way that required real technical judgment, because hair that was over-processed would be permanently damaged. A successful permanent wave gave a woman's hair the texture and body to hold a weekly set with minimal effort, to stay in shape through humidity and light rain, and to require less time and product to style than straight hair. For women whose natural hair was fine or straight, a permanent wave was not a luxury. It was the technical foundation on which the rest of their beauty maintenance rested. Hair coloring was done in the salon, though it was less openly discussed than it would become in later decades. Rinses were common, temporary colors that added warmth or depth without the commitment of permanent color. Bleaching and toning for women who wanted to be blonde required the skilled application that only a trained operator could provide safely, and the results ranged from beautiful to disastrous, depending on the skill of the person doing them, and the condition and natural color of the hair being treated. Haircutting in the 1950s was done, but it was not the primary service focus in the way it became in later decades, when shorter, more geometric cuts that required frequent trimming replaced the longer styles that could grow out for months between cuts. The cuts of the 1950s were typically to shape and thin hair for setting purposes, rather than to create a precise geometric form. And they were done with shears and thinning shears by an operator who understood hair in motion rather than hair as architecture. Manicures were offered in most salons and were the secondary service that many women added to their hair appointment. The nailwork of the 1950s was precise and specific. Nails were shaped to the oval form that the era considered correct. Cuticles were pushed back and cleaned with an orange stick and cuticle remover, and the polish was applied in the specific two-coat method that produced the even, high-gloss finish that the era's beauty standards required. Red was the most popular color, the particular red of the 1950s that was neither the blue red of earlier decades nor the orange red of later ones, but a pure, clear, medium red that photographed beautifully in the era's black and white images and looked striking in person. Facials were available in better salons, performed in a separate room or at a dedicated facial chair, and consisted of cleansing, steaming, massage, masking, and toning in a sequence that could take an hour and that produced results visible enough to generate repeat business. The products used were simpler than modern facial treatments, but the technique, particularly the massage, was carried out with a skill that the best modern facialists have preserved, while some of the mass-market versions have lost. The conversation. What was said and what was not. The conversation of a 1950s beauty salon was its own complete world, and any account of what those salons were actually like that does not give it serious attention is missing the thing that most women who were there would have named first if asked what they remembered. It was not gossip, though gossip was not absent. The simplification of salon conversation as gossip misses what it actually was. which was something more like the social metabolism of a community. The women who came to the same salon week after week were the women who lived in the same neighborhood, attended the same churches, had children in the same schools, knew the same families, navigated the same local politics and social dynamics. The conversation that moved between them under the dryers and in the chairs was not merely entertainment. It was information exchange, community maintenance, the ongoing process by which a neighborhood understood itself. A woman whose husband had lost his job would find that the neighborhood already knew by the time she came to the salon on Thursday, because someone who was close to the family had mentioned it in passing on Monday, framed with the appropriate discretion and concern. And by Thursday, the neighborhood was ready to be helpful in the quiet, practical ways that communities sometimes still manage. A woman whose mother was ill would find sympathy already waiting for her at the shampoo bowl. A woman whose daughter was getting married would find that everyone wanted to hear the details, and that the shared pleasure of the telling was its own small celebration. There was also the conversation that stayed in the salon, the things said under the dryer that were not meant to travel, the admission of worry that could not be made at home without frightening the children, the frustration with a husband expressed in terms mild enough to preserve the marriage's dignity, but clear enough to be heard by the woman in the next chair who understood without requiring the full explanation. The question about a health symptom that was too frightening to ask a doctor about directly, but could be floated in this company and receive the combined wisdom of 6 women who between them had experienced most of what life had to offer. The operator was the keeper of all of this. She heard everything, repeated nothing outside the salon walls, and managed the conversation the way a skilled host manages a dinner party, keeping it moving when it stalled, redirecting it when it went somewhere uncomfortable, amplifying it when it needed amplification. She also understood when a woman came in needing not to talk, when the set of a jaw and the quality of a greeting said that today was not a day for the salon's usual warmth and chatter, but for something quieter. She provided that too. The conversation was calibrated to what was needed, and what was needed was not always the same thing 2 weeks in a row. The ritual of beauty and what it meant to be attended to. There is a quality to being touched by someone with skill that is completely different from being touched by someone applying a product. The operator's hands in a 1950s salon moved through hair with the particular confidence of a person who had performed the same actions thousands of times and had developed in those repetitions a kind of knowledge that lived in the hands rather than the head. The shampoo was not a scrub, it was a massage. The scalp received real attention for several minutes, something that few women gave to themselves at home under the pressure of a morning schedule and the awareness of everyone waiting for the bathroom. The massage quality of the professional shampoo was something women mentioned when they talked about what the salon gave them, and the simple explanation is that it was one of the few times in many women's weeks when they were touched with complete, skilled, positive attention with no agenda other than their comfort and the quality of the work. A mother spent her days touching others, tending others, moving through a house and a family that required her hands constantly. The salon reversed that direction for an hour. Someone's hands were on her, attending to her, for no reason except her own well-being and appearance. The finishing comb-out was its own particular pleasure. The rollers came out, and the hair fell in its sections of formed curl. And then the operator's hands moved through it with the rat-tail comb, releasing each curl, blending them together, shaping the crown, smoothing the sides, building the finished style from the constituent parts of the set. This was the moment the woman in the chair watched herself in the mirror change from someone mid-process with pins and net and the temporarily alarming appearance of a head in rollers to someone finished, composed, recognizably herself, but better, lighter, more polished than she had been an hour and a half ago. The transformation was real, and it was personal, and it happened every week, which is part of why it mattered so much. It was not a special occasion transformation. It was the regular, weekly restoration of the self that the week had slightly worn down. She came in looking like the week she had just had. She left looking like the woman she understood herself to be at her best. The economics. Who owned these salons, and who could afford them? The beauty salon of the 1950s was more democratically distributed across income levels than most luxury services of the era, partly because of the economics of the service itself and partly because of the economics of the women's workplace. Most 1950s beauty salons were small businesses owned by women. This was one of the few business categories in which women's ownership was common and accepted, partly because the skills required were female-coded in ways that did not threaten the era's gender arrangements, and partly because the clientele was almost entirely female, and women business owners serving women clients was a social arrangement that made everyone comfortable. The owner-operator salon, in which the woman who owned the business also worked in it daily, was the most common format. She had taken out a small business loan or saved from years of working as an employed operator. She had leased or purchased a small storefront. She had bought her equipment, the chairs and dryers and shampoo bowls, and the dozens of smaller tools and products that stocked the back bar. She had built her clientele over years of skilled work and reliable relationship. These were not wealthy businesses. The margins in a service business that sells one operator's time are inherently limited by the number of hours available and the prices the local market will bear. A busy operator in a full-time salon in the 1950s might see 8 to 10 clients on a good day. At the prices of the era, which were typically between $1 and $3 for a shampoo and set, and somewhat more for a permanent, the gross revenue was modest. But it was steady, and it was the operator's own, and the women who built these businesses in the post-war decade were exercising a kind of economic independence that was less available to them in almost any other sector. The beauty industry was one of the places where the 1950s housewife could be something other than a housewife, and many women who ran salons had begun their careers precisely because they needed an income that was theirs and a business that was theirs and work that was theirs, in an era that offered very few avenues for that. The prices that made the service accessible to working-class and lower-middle-class women were also a function of the competitive market that existed in most neighborhoods. Most residential areas of any size had multiple salons, and they competed on service, relationship, and skill rather than on price alone. A woman who found an operator she trusted stayed with her for years, which meant that the quality of the relationship and the consistency of the results mattered more than a small price difference in either direction. The segregated salon, the full picture. Any honest account of the 1950s American beauty salon has to include what has been too often left out of nostalgic recollections of the era, which is that these salons were, across most of the country, racially segregated. Black women in the 1950s did not, in most cities and towns outside the urban north, walk into the same salons that white women walked into. They had their own salons, many of them extraordinarily skilled businesses serving communities with their own beauty traditions, their own techniques, their own products developed specifically for the hair textures and styling needs that white-owned beauty supply companies largely ignored. The black beauty salon of the 1950s served every function that we have described here, and often more. In communities where segregation circumscribed nearly every aspect of public life, the beauty salon was one of the spaces where Black women could be fully themselves, be attended to with care, speak freely, and build the community bonds that sustained the civil rights activism that was, in this same decade, beginning to change the country. The Black beauty salon was not separate from the civil rights movement. It was, in many communities, one of its organizing spaces. The history of the 1950s American beauty salon is not one history. It is, at minimum, two histories, running in parallel, shaped by the same era and the same basic human need for care and community, but divided by the structural racism that defined the decade. Both stories are worth telling. We have focused here on the more commonly described white salon experience, and we acknowledge that the full picture is larger and more complicated than this single account can contain. The products of the era. The products used in a 1950s beauty salon were simple by modern standards, few in number, and effective in ways that required skill to realize, because the skill was in the application rather than in the formulation. Setting lotion was the primary styling product. Applied to damp hair before rolling, it provided the hold that kept the set in shape through the drying process and beyond. The formulations of the 1950s were alcohol-based and did exactly what they claimed to do, which was stiffen the hair slightly while it dried into shape, and then release to a soft, flexible hold when combed out. The smell of setting lotion is one of the specific olfactory signatures of the era's beauty salon, slightly medicinal, slightly floral, entirely unmistakable to anyone who was there. Permanent wave solution in the 1950s was thioglycolate-based, the same chemistry that underlies modern permanent wave products. The skill in its use was in the timing and the assessment of processing progress, which required the operator to examine a test curl periodically during processing and make the judgment call of when to neutralize based on what she saw and felt rather than on a fixed time. Over-processing meant damaged, frizzy hair. Under-processing meant a wave that fell out within weeks. The correct call, made consistently across years of experience, was the foundation of a reputation. Hairspray as a category product became widely available in the early 1950s, with the introduction of aerosol formulations, and it transformed the finishing step of the salon service significantly. Before aerosol hairspray, the hold of the finished style depended entirely on the setting process and on the skill of the comb-out. After its introduction, the operator could apply a fine mist of lacquer that preserved the style against humidity and movement in ways that the set alone could not guarantee. The particular stiffness of a well-lacquered 1950s set, its resistance to the vagaries of weather and activity, was one of the specific qualities that defined the era's beauty aesthetic and that required the product to achieve. Hair color products were more limited than their modern equivalents and more chemistry-dependent in their application. The metallic dyes that had been common in earlier decades were being replaced by aniline derivative tints that offered more predictable color results, but that required a patch test and careful application because they could cause serious allergic reactions in sensitive individuals. The operator who colored hair needed to understand basic color theory, the principles of lifting existing pigment before depositing new color, the way the natural undertones of the hair would interact with the artificial color being applied. These were professional products, in the genuine sense. They were sold through professional supply channels that were not available to the general public. The formulations were stronger than the at-home versions that were beginning to be marketed directly to consumers in this same decade. And their correct use required the knowledge and skill that licensed cosmetology training provided, not as a regulatory formality, but as a genuine prerequisite for safe and effective application. The experience of time. What being in the salon did to the clock. One of the things that women who remember 1950s salons describe consistently, and that is easy to overlook in accounts that focus on the technical services, is what the salon did to time. The salon appointment was a fixed block of 2 hours or more, in which the woman who was there was neither expected nor able to do anything other than be there. The shampoo required her to recline and be still. The rolling required her to sit in the chair and give her head to someone else's hands. The dryer enclosed her in its warm hum and effectively isolated her from the rest of the salon, making real conversation difficult and enforced stillness comfortable. In a daily life in which she was the manager, the initiator, the person who saw what needed to be done and did it or organized others to do it, the salon appointment was the reversal of that role for a defined and legitimate period of time. She was not managing, she was being managed, gently, expertly, with her comfort as the explicit priority. The effect on time was that it slowed, not unpleasantly. The particular quality of time under the dryer with a magazine and a coffee, when nothing was required and nothing could be usefully done anyway, because her hair was in rollers and her nails were still drying, and she was simply there, being attended to, was unlike time experienced anywhere else in the week. It was time that restored, rather than depleted. Modern life has more leisure options than the 1950s offered, and significantly less of this particular quality of enforced, legitimate, guilt-free stillness in a warm room where someone else was handling everything. The woman who sat under the salon dryer with her magazine was not unproductive because she had nothing else she could have been doing. She was there on purpose. The appointment was the purpose. The being there was the point. That is something the modern leisure economy, with its constant pressure to optimize even rest time and its suspicion of any hour that is not in some way improving the person spending it, has almost entirely lost. What you looked like walking out. We have saved the most visible part of the salon experience for near the end, because by now you understand that the visible result was only the most obvious layer of what the salon produced, not the whole of it. But the visible result was real, and it was the reason the appointment was made in the first place. So it deserves its full description. A woman who left a 1950s beauty salon after a complete appointment looked the way the era's beauty aesthetic intended a woman to look when she was at her maintained best. Her hair was set in the smooth-shaped waves or curls of the chosen style. For most women in the early 1950s, this meant either the softer waves of a style influenced by the previous decade's romantic aesthetics, or the more structured, controlled curls of the emerging decade's look that would solidify into the distinct styles associated with the period by mid-decade. The hair was smooth where it was supposed to be smooth, and shaped where it was supposed to be shaped. And it held that shape because the set and the lacquer had done their jobs correctly. The nails, if she had had a manicure, were the oval, polished, unchipped red or soft pink of the era's standard, and they caught the light with the high-gloss reflection that the correct topcoat produced. The hands that carried those nails had been moisturized and treated, and were, within the limits of what a manicure could do for working hands, their best available version of themselves. But beyond the specific details of hair and nails was the overall quality of a person who had spent 2 hours being attended to. The posture was slightly better than it had been going in, because she had been sitting in a proper salon chair rather than hunching over a counter or stooping for a child. The face was more relaxed because the conversation and the warmth and the enforced stillness of the dryer had released some of what the week had compressed into the jaw and the brow. The eyes were brighter because she had for 2 hours not been responsible for managing anything. She looked, in the specific and simple truth of it, like herself. Not the version of herself that the week wore down. The version of herself that she recognized in the mirror as who she actually was when the weight of everything else was temporarily lifted. And she walked out onto the sidewalk, looking that way, and carried it through the rest of the week until the week wore it down again. And it was time to push open that door once more and be restored. The legacy. What those salons left behind. The beauty salon of the 1950s did not survive intact into the following decades. The styles it served changed. The relationship model it operated on changed. The economics of the service changed, as larger chains replaced neighborhood owner-operators in many markets. And the role of the salon in women's lives changed, as those lives changed around it. But it left things behind that are worth naming. It left the model of the trusted professional relationship, the beauty operator who knew her clients as whole people rather than as hair types, that the best modern salon relationships still replicate when they are at their best, and that clients still seek when they find themselves explaining to a new stylist who they are and realizing they miss the one who already knew. It left the understanding that a service that attends to appearance is not a superficial service, that how a person looks is connected to how a person feels, and that the regular, skilled, caring attention to one's own physical presentation is not vanity, but maintenance of the kind that every machine and building and garden requires, and that human beings require no less than any of these. It left the specific social model of the community that gathered around the service, the weekly assembly of women who knew one another well enough to speak honestly and carefully enough to do so with kindness, who maintained the social fabric of their neighborhoods in those conversations, under the dryers, and in those chairs that someone else's skilled hands moved through with professional care. And it left the memory, clear and warm in the minds of the women who were there, and in the second-hand memory of the daughters and granddaughters who heard about it, of a place where women were the clients and the operators and the owners and the community, where a door pushed open admitted you to a world that was entirely organized around your comfort and appearance and well-being, and where the 2 hours you spent there restored something that the week took from you, with a reliability that no other single hour or place in the week could match. That is what 1950s American beauty salons were actually like. Not just the smell of setting lotion and the hum of the dryer, though those were real. Not just the red nails and the shaped sets and the specific visual aesthetic of the decade, though those were real too. The whole of it. The relationship, the conversation, the community, the enforced, legitimate, warm, and welcomed stillness, the skilled and caring hands, the woman walking out looking like herself at her best, the door you pushed open, and the world that was different on the other side of it. Please subscribe before you go. We will keep finding these forgotten corners of American life for as long as they are worth visiting, and we believe they are worth visiting for a long time yet.